Some records are sealed by accident. A box is mislabeled, a clerk retires, a courthouse floods, and 100 years pass before anyone opens the folder again. And some records are sealed on purpose, by men who read them, understood them, and decided that the truth would do more harm to the living than the lie. The case of Verna Sykes was sealed both ways. It was hidden on purpose in 1920, and then it was forgotten by accident for the next century, and it might never have surfaced at all if a young archivist in Madison County, North Carolina, cataloging a water-damaged collection in 2021, had not pried open a tin document box that had rusted shut, and found inside it the coroner's file that the county had spent 100 years pretending did not exist. Before I tell you what was in that box, do something for me. Drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from and who is in the house with you tonight. I ask because the woman in this story made her living by who came to stay under her roof, and by the time we are done, you will think differently about the simple act of opening your door to a stranger who needs a bed. Madison County in 1920 was high, cold country on the Tennessee line, a place of steep coves and switchback roads where the railroad had only just begun to reach. People still traveled on foot and by wagon, and a journey of 40 miles might take 2 days, which meant that the country between towns was dotted with boarding houses, places where a traveler could buy a meal and a bed and a roof against the weather. These houses were almost always kept by women, often widows, because a widow in that era and that place had almost no other way to earn a living. She could not easily own a farm alone. She could not take most trades. But she could keep a clean house, set a good table, and rent out rooms. And so the boarding house was one of the few respectable economic lifeboats available to a woman left alone. This is important. Hold on to it. It is the whole shape of the story. Verna Sykes kept such a house on the road between Marshall and Hot Springs, in a cove the old deeds called Sykes Bottom. She was, according to the 1910 census, 40 years old, widowed, with one grown son named Calloway, who lived with her and helped with the heavy work. She was known up and down that road as a fine cook and a generous host. Travelers spoke of her cornbread and her ham and the warmth of her front room, and a man coming down off the cold mountain in November was glad to see the light in her windows. She wore her hair pinned tight and plain. She dressed in dark, mended clothes, the dress of a woman with no money to waste and a respectable name to keep. Her hands were strong and reddened from work, and she had a way, several survivors of her acquaintance later recalled, of looking at a man's coat and his boots and his baggage when he came through the door, sizing up his road and his prospects, the way an innkeeper naturally does. Or so everyone assumed. For years there was nothing unusual about the house in Sykes Bottom. Travelers came and stayed a night and went on their way, and most of them did exactly that, because Verna Sykes was not a fool and did not foul her own nest. She let the ordinary travelers, the ones with families and homes and people expecting them, pass through untouched. She was patient. She was selective. The first sign of what she really was is buried so deep in the ordinary traffic of the road that it took the county 100 years and a rusted box to see it. The man's name was Presley Coons, and he was last seen alive in October of 1916. Coons was a peddler of patent medicines who worked the mountain roads, a man with no wife, no children, and a satchel full of cash from a season of sales. He stopped at the Sykes house meaning to stay one night and was never seen on the road again. But a peddler with no family is exactly the kind of man whose absence raises no alarm. He had told people in Marshall he was bound for Tennessee. When he did not come back through, everyone assumed he had simply gone on into Tennessee and kept selling. Nobody thought too much of it. Men like Coons drifted in and out of the county like smoke. It happened. And then it happened again. A timber buyer named Witt, traveling alone with a roll of company money to purchase standing oak, stopped at Sykes Bottom in the spring of 1917 and did not arrive at his next appointment. And then a discharged soldier walking home to Tennessee with his back pay. And then a widower selling off his late wife's land and carrying the proceeds. The pattern, when you lay the cases side by side as the archivist eventually did, is not subtle at all. Every one of them was a man traveling alone, with no close family to raise a hue and cry, and carrying money. Verna Sykes did not choose her guests by chance. She chose them the way a trapper chooses where to set a snare, by reading the sign, and the sign she read was a lonely man with a full purse and no one to miss him. There is a detail in the recovered file that turns the stomach precisely because it shows how careful she was. Verna Sykes kept a guest book. Most boarding houses did, for the simple business reason of knowing who owed what, and hers was an ordinary ledger of names and dates and the price of a bed and a supper. When the archivist compared the surviving pages of that guest book against the list of the men later found on the property, she discovered that not one of the murdered men appeared in it. Verna had written down every harmless traveler who passed through, the families and the couples and the men with people waiting on them, and she had left no written trace of a single one of the men she killed. The guest book was not a record. It was an alibi, kept faithfully for years, a tidy ledger of the living designed to make the missing seem as though they had never come at all. She understood that the absence of a name was safer than any lie she could write. The timber company did send an inquiry about Witt. It is in the file, a polite letter from a lumber concern in Asheville asking the Madison County Sheriff whether anyone had seen their buyer, who had been carrying funds and had not reported in. The sheriff at the time made a note that he had inquired along the Marshall Road and learned that the man had passed through bound for Tennessee and must have met his misfortune across the line. The note closes the matter in 2 sentences. A man with a company behind him, with money owed and accounts to settle, and still the easy answer held. Because the easy answer always involves the road and the mountain, and never the warm house with the good cook. It is always simpler to blame the wilderness than the woman who lives at its edge. But here is the thing that let her do it for so long. Every single one of those men had told someone they were headed somewhere else. That was the genius of the road. A man who vanishes from a boarding house has, by definition, just announced to the world that he is about to travel into country where vanishing is ordinary. When Presley Coons did not arrive in Tennessee, the people in Tennessee assumed he had never left North Carolina. And the people in North Carolina assumed he had safely reached Tennessee. And the gap between those 2 assumptions was exactly the size of one woman's front room. She lived in the seam between 2 communities, and she made the seam swallow men whole. But what investigators would eventually understand is that the killing was only half of what made Verna Sykes so dangerous. The other half was how completely she had erased the men afterward, so completely that the county would not realize the scale of it until they began to dig, and what they would find in the ground beneath that welcoming house would force every man on the search party to reconsider every kind word they had ever heard about the widow in Sykes Bottom. The person who finally pulled at the thread was a Madison County deputy named Otho Frisbee. In the autumn of 1919, the brother of the vanished widower, a determined man who did not believe his sibling had simply walked off the earth with the family land money, came to the county and would not be put off. He had traced his brother as far as the Sykes house and no farther. Frisbee was, by his own later account, reluctant. He was 36, a practical man who had no wish to accuse a respected widow of anything, and he went out to Sykes Bottom, expecting to clear her name and send the grieving brother home. In a statement preserved in the recovered file, Frisbee wrote that Verna Sykes received him with perfect courtesy, served him coffee, and answered every question without a flicker. The widower, she said, had stayed one night and left at dawn, bound north. She was sorry to hear he was missing. The roads were so dangerous for a man traveling alone. It was the son who gave it away. Calloway Sykes, then in his late 20s, sat in the corner of the front room during the whole interview and said nothing, but Frisbee noticed that the young man's eyes went to his mother's face before every answer she gave, as though checking, as though waiting to be told what was true. Frisbee wrote in his private notes, the notes that did not go into the official report, that he had seen that look before, on the faces of men who had done terrible things together and were afraid one of them might break. He left the house with his suspicions and no proof. But he came back. He came back with a county magistrate and a warrant to search the property, and he made Calloway Sykes walk him through every building on the place. And he watched the young man, not the mother, and he saw where the young man would not look. What Frisbee found is laid out in the coroner's file in language so flat and clinical that it is almost worse than horror. The Sykes house had a spring house, a small stone structure built over the cold water where a mountain family kept milk and butter from spoiling. Beneath its floor, and beneath the floor of the smokehouse, and at the bottom of an old hand-dug well that had supposedly gone dry years before, the search party recovered the remains of 11 men. 11. The coroner's notes record that several still had their boots. One still had a leather money belt, empty. The cause of death, where it could be determined, was consistent across the bodies. Verna Sykes had not used a weapon that left a wound. She had used her kitchen. The men had been poisoned at her table, in her good food, by a woman they trusted enough to eat from her hand, and they had died in the beds she made up so clean and warm, and her son had carried them out in the dark. The county doctor who examined the remains, a physician named Edmonds, wrote a separate report that the court folded into the sealed file, and it is from Edmonds that we know the method. The bodies that were recovered intact enough to test showed the signs he associated with arsenic, which in that era could be bought at any store for killing rats, and was untraceable in a kitchen that prepared 100 honest meals for every poisoned one. Edmonds noted, almost as an aside, that the cold spring water beneath the spring house had preserved some of the remains far better than ordinary ground would have, and that this was how they could be identified at all, and that Verna Sykes had almost certainly chosen that ground for the opposite reason. Never imagining the cold would one day testify against her, the very thing she trusted to hide her work was the thing that kept it whole enough to be read. There was one more detail, and it is the one that haunted Frisbee for the rest of his career. In a trunk in Verna Sykes' own bedroom, the searchers found a collection of small objects. A pocket watch, a folding knife, a pair of spectacles, a St. Christopher medal on a broken chain, 11 keepsakes, one from each man, wrapped carefully in cloth and kept. She had not sold them, though they had value. She had taken something small from each of them and saved it. No one ever learned why. Frisbee wrote that he could make peace with the money, with the cold arithmetic of a poor woman robbing the men who passed her door, but that he could not make peace with the trunk, because the trunk meant she had wanted to remember them, and a woman who wants to remember the men she has killed is a kind of person he had no name for. Outside, the cove was quiet. The spring still ran cold over the stones. The house looked exactly as welcoming as it always had. Verna Sykes never confessed and never explained. At her arraignment, which the county held quietly and kept out of the papers, she said only that the men had owed her and she had collected, and then she said nothing else for the rest of her life. Calloway broke, as Frisbee had known he would, and told the magistrate that he had been helping his mother since he was a boy, that he had never questioned it, that she had told him the men were bad men, and that what they did was justice. He did not seem to fully understand that it was not. Verna Sykes died in custody before her trial concluded, of a fever, in the winter of 1920, taking the count and the reasons with her. Calloway was sent away to the state asylum, where the records say he lived another 30 years, harmless, quiet, asking after his mother until the end. The county, horrified and ashamed that such a thing had gone on for years in plain sight on a public road, sealed the file to spare the families of the dead and to spare itself. And there it stayed, in a rusting tin box, for 100 years. Today there is nothing left of the house in Sykes Bottom but a chimney and a depression in the ground where the cellar was. The land is private and posted, and the family that owns it now will tell you only that the old well was filled with stone and concrete 2 generations ago, and that no one in the family will go near the spot after dark. When the archivist's discovery made the local paper in 2021, an elderly woman wrote in to say that her grandmother had grown up nearby and had always been forbidden, as a child, to take the road past Sykes Bottom alone, and had never been told why. The warning had outlived the reason by 100 years. The fear had been passed down even after the file that explained it had rusted shut. Was Verna Sykes a monster, or was she a woman the world had cornered? It is the question that sits at the center of this case and refuses to be answered cleanly. She lived in a time and a place that gave a widow no power, no property she could safely hold, no way to be secure except through a man, and the men in her life had left her with a son to raise, and a house to keep, and nothing else. Somewhere in that hard arithmetic she decided that the lonely, moneyed men who came down off the mountain were owed to her, and she built a quiet machine to collect them, and she taught her own child to feed it. She was a victim of her circumstances, who became something far worse than her circumstances ever were. Both of those things are true at once, and that is exactly why the case is so hard to put down. This is one of the darkest and most complicated cases ever recovered from the sealed records of the Carolina Mountains, and we very nearly never knew it happened at all. Tell me in the comments what you believe Verna Sykes truly was. A desperate woman the world failed, or a predator who hid behind a widow's black dress. I will be reading the arguments on both sides, and if this story unsettled you, and you want to keep following the histories that were buried on purpose, subscribe and stay close, because there are more rusted boxes in those courthouses than anyone wants to admit. Until next time, be careful whose table you sit at, and mind the light in the window.